Hi, this is DAHU. I'm a melodic techno producer and you might already know me from my releases on Radicon. Today we're going to look at a track I produced using only samples from the Production Music Live Everything bundle and plugins native to Ableton. So let's dive right in. I went for a pretty heavily melodic approach here. I think the track is very heavy, has a lot of pathos, a lot of reverb. It's really centered around the synths, which we'll get later on in the video. But first of all, let's just look at how it's structured. So we've got a few buses here. So it's split up into the lows, which has the kick, the kind of low bass frequencies, and a higher bass right here. Then we've got the drum channel with a bunch of hats, a bunch of claps, pretty standard stuff really. Then we've got the part that really carries the track, in my opinion at least, which is the leads, split up into two leads that are based on simpler, and we'll dive into them a little bit later. And then there's kind of a transitional element that's built from these two. This build-up element that you just heard earlier, this kind of squelchy, pretty quick RP element. And then we've got an atmosphere channel with a lot of reverb, just kind of setting the scene for everything else to work and gel it together a little bit. And then just an effects section down here with a bunch of reverse risers, impacts, stuff like that, you know. Then let's take a look at what we've got here. First of all, let's just start top to bottom and take a look at the lows first. So if I solo this channel, we've got a pretty standard kick. I think I took one from, yeah, it's a Ben Böhmer set from the Production Music Live artist pack that he did. It's really nice. It has kind of a nice click that kind of cuts through the mix, and it's not super long, so we can pair it really easily with this sub that plays on the offbeats. If we just listen to the two together, kind of really adds to the groove that we've got, like this punchy kick and then the sub to kind of give it more movement. And then to add on top of that, we've got kind of a higher bass channel that it doesn't follow like the 4 to the floor thing completely, which kind of breaks it up and gives it more of like the rolling character. So if you listen to it with this. I've already got a pretty strong techno groove here, like really simple but really driving as well. And there's really not that much going on here, like this kick sample is already really powerful. I just took out a tiny little bit of the click on the kick here. There's actually no compression going on at all. I just felt like, you know, it was punchy enough by itself. And then here in the sub, I wanted to go with a little bit of a, you know, a grittier approach. So I actually didn't take a tom-tom groove here, but it's more like a percussive one. So if we open this up, let's solo it for a second. There's like a lot of top-end information in here that I wanted to get rid of. So it's like really just using the subby part for the throbbing kind of sub-bass part. And then for this high bass, it's actually also a sample from the Masquerade pack, which I think is super nice, especially for like this heavier techno. We listen to it here. There's not much editing going on other than because I wanted to have like a very kind of monumental feel to the track and like a big room feel. There's like a lot of reverb even in the higher basses going on just to make sure it has that big room presence. All right, so let's check out what happens if we listen to it with the drums active. Yeah, this is supposed to be a very efficient groove. So the idea here is that we just want like a simple, efficient groove that leaves a lot of room for these synths that for me are the focal point of the track to really have room and do their thing and really unfold without being too heavily limited by like frequencies from the drum channel, for example, or also by too much busyness in that area. So the first thing I did here, if we look at this channel, let's look at this one first because this is the first hat that actually appears. You can see I cut off basically all the mids and the lows, and there's only high frequencies in this kind of main hat that's kind of running most of the time. It's more like a blip. If we take out the auto filter, this is kind of the original sound that it's based on, and it's like super percussive and has a lot of information, but I kind of want to keep that mid area clean for the synths to have more room. So I really just want to use the rhythmic component of it. So we're cutting out all these lows, and then the erosion here is also extremely important. So if we take out the erosion, and now with it, You can really hear it just adds texture and thump a little bit, or like that high sizzly thump, if you know what I mean. Yeah, and for the other hat channels, it was kind of the same thing. They're all focused on the kind of super high frequency range, trying to be very sizzling, trying to like just leave a lot of room in the mids. And also what I really like to do in a lot of these tracks, you can experiment with that on hat channels especially, is using the corpus effect. So the corpus is a resonator that kind of adds harmonic overtones. And if you use it in beam mode, it can be used to turn samples that don't have a lot of harmonic information into like really more organic sounds that can really like carry the melody of your track much more. So if we look at it in context of this hat sample, let's play it first of all without the corpus. I mean, it's a nice and powerful hat, but I think, you know, there's just, if you add a bit of harmonics to it, you can just really make it gel more with the track. So if we add the corpus, you can hear there's a metallic overtone, and it just sounds, you know, more real and more alive this way. And that's like a great way of not only getting that effect, but also, as you can see here, there's a tune functionality. So you can actually pitch your drums and the harmonic information in your drums to the root note of your track, which just makes it all gel together much nicer. And then down here, we've got a bunch of claps, but there's not really, you know, that much special stuff going on here. So I think I want to focus more on the lead channels over here. Let's check out the lead first of all. So what I did here was I split this lead into two parts and into two channels. And the reasoning for that, I'll explain a little bit later, but it's basically the same lead and it's sample based. Let's first of all listen to what it sounds like here. Yeah, it's got kind of that pathos going. It's very simple, but also very melancholic, but also just carries, for me, this kind of monumental feeling, which I like a lot. I want to split this into two parts. First of all, I want to talk about the MIDI clip here. So there's a few things you can notice. First of all, it's not snapped to the grid. It wouldn't make that much sense to use it snapped to the grid here anyway, because it has a long attack, which means, you know, the note won't actually start playing immediately after the MIDI note is triggered, but, you know, it has to do the attack curve first. And I just feel like if you have these sounds that have an attack curve, you benefit a lot from this kind of up and down movement if you just do it by ear and you don't snap it to the grid and just like move your notes around until they have a little bit of shuffle and they just sit perfectly in the track. And then the other thing we have here are these ghost notes. So this groove or this melody is like super simple, and to really make it work, we have to add a little bit more interesting texture to it. And I think that's what these ghost notes achieve. They just give it more rhythmic information and make it a little bit staccato, even though it isn't. And if you combine that with the second part of this clip here, where you can see got it running on the root note, it's actually not E, but because it's sample based, this is actually the root note. But here we have to use an E, because the original sample is not in C. So for the second part of this clip, we go up by a semitone, which is the tension note in this scale. So that way we're really getting this drama in this kind of clip. So let's listen to it again, keeping that in mind. Then next, let's dive into how the sound is actually made. And it's actually a combination of things here. So it's a simpler and it's a bass loop actually from the Masquerade sound pack. This is like the original sound. So if we take out all of the post-processing here, or all the processing after the sample, this is what we actually start with. Oh, let me solo it quickly. So it's kind of harsh, but it's also interesting because it has this kind of squelchy, a little bit metallic sound, but it cannot stand alone like this, you know? The sound is way too choppy in a way. And that's why we need a lot of heavy modulation back here. But if we just play this note, oh, the track's already armed, okay. You can see it's actually based on kind of a bassy arp, or a bass arp here, and pitching it up gives us this kind of choppy, squelchy sound. that I think is really interesting, but we definitely need the post-processing to, you know, make it melodically more pleasing, I would say. And the way we want to achieve that here is, the most important thing here is this echo. And this is actually, you know, it has kind of uncommon settings here. First of all, the feedback is set very high, and the dry wet is as well. And then it's also set to very quick repetitions. And what I wanted to do here is kind of work with this choppiness, this metallic effect that we get by pitching this bass up, but also putting an atmosphere on it, but in a way that kind of supports what's actually nice about the original sound. So let's just A/B it really quickly here. Yeah, so this chain is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. So it's actually taking what's nice about this original sound, but actually really bringing out like the melodic power of it and the beauty of it, kind of. And afterwards, we've just got a little bit of reverb, notched out a frequency here that I didn't like. Yeah, just a spectrum to make sure we don't go crazy here with our frequencies. And then there's a delay back here that's actually automated to, you know, lead up to the break back here. So it's actually not active right now. Let's look at it. Yeah, it's just kind of coming in here, leading up to this peak. And the special thing here with the sample is that it actually kind of opens up the filter. So if we like go back here, it's a bit more congested. And then up here we have like an opener part of it, a little more open part of it. And what I wanted to do is kind of make that open up even more over the track, but actually you cannot automate this parameter. So I just decided to kind of, you know, split the lead into two channels. And if you look at this one, I have to zoom out a little bit so you can see. This one starts later in the sample, and that's kind of the part where the sample is most open and most energetic, you know. So I decided to just split it into two parts, and also the echo on this part here is a bit heavier to make it even more atmospheric. To make sure we've got a progression here, you know, we've got the diminished drop where we introduce this sound, and then we can kind of add a layer on top of that in the second drop by opening it up even more, by starting the sample at an opener, at a part where it's more open, and then adding more of this echo on top. So let's listen to this part. Alright, so yeah, basically the same story for this channel. The only thing is that we're starting the sample at a little bit later space here, and we're adding more of the echo on top of it. The important thing though, if you work with a simpler, which is a really cool technique in my opinion, to get interesting synth sounds, because, you know, we started with a bass and now we've got like this kind of, you know, high-pitched atmospheric squelchy synth, which is, you know, very interesting, doesn't sound very common, is that you have to watch out a little bit because it's gonna, you know, loop this part, or there can be a lot of artifacts and problems that arise, you know, because you're working with samples that are heavily being contorted. So one thing that you can do to avoid that a little bit is make sure you're starting your sound at an amplitude of 0. That way you're gonna have less artifacts in the beginning. Just a little tip to avoid problems down the road. And then let's look at this next channel here. So what I like to do basically a lot of the time is when I have a sound that I think is interesting and could really carry a track, I want to build the whole track on top of it. Like, I don't want to go too crazy and introduce more elements and more nuances and more directions. I kind of, once I have an idea I'm happy with, I just want to commit to that idea. And to achieve that, often what I like to do is just, I have a synth that I built that I really like that's carrying the track. And if I need more elements, like for example, transitional elements, risers, stuff like that, then I just tried to build a new channel that's based on the same sound. And that's what I tried to do here with these transitional elements. So this lead sweep is actually based on the same approach that how these two channels were made. So if we look into it, we've got again this masquerade synth loop. This time it's over the full duration because I want to make a sweep. And the difference here is, if we look into the MIDI, we've only got these two notes. Let's listen to it first of all. And it's pitching from B5 to B3 here, or you know, the equivalents from the sample. And we're creating from the same sample that's actually producing our lead synth, we're creating this sweep. So it's like really aesthetically in tune with the rest of our track, even though it's a transitional element. And what we did here was we introduced glide. So for the other two channels, the glide was set to off. By the way, if you put on glide, it's going to turn on legato mode. So you cannot play chords, as is the case with the other two synthesizers. Just be aware of that, or the other two simplers. And we just set a time, like kind of a moderate time here, to make sure that, you know, we've got this energetic pitching of the sound. If we play around with that, let's try a shorter glide time here. Also kind of a cool effect, kind of a bit more alien invasion, or if we go higher. Yeah, there's a lot of things you can do here. And I think actually this is a very underused and very powerful way to do creative sound design. We're using this bass loop we created our synths from here. But you can pull any sample into the simpler. You can pull a percussion loop in here and make it pitch from C6 to C-1. And that can create crazy acoustic effects, like if you play around with that. And it's so easy to do because all you do is, you know, you drag it in, you set the glide, you set the time, and you just hit keys on the keyboard and it's gonna do like crazy pitch sweeps. You can try it with percussion samples, you know, guitars, you can pitch up drones, you know, there's a lot of possibilities for creative sound design, and it's super easy. So I think this is like really something that a lot of people could get a lot out of to experiment with. And yeah, let's set it back to 2.6 where it was before. And afterwards, we were just notching out some frequencies again that we don't like here. And then there's another part to this sound. To just make it, because it's this transitional element, it's supposed to morph a lot, you know, it's supposed to have a lot of movement, create a lot of tension. And we're achieving this by having the auto filter back here that's set to pretty heavy LFO. So actually it's making, you know, there's no visual representation of this here, but it's actually making this curve move like this, you know, back and forth here. And I can maybe exaggerate it to show you what I mean. Or if we set the rate higher. So it's actually just introducing even more movement into the whole thing. Let's set it back to where it was here and check it out with the entire track. Yeah, it's just these little things, you know, that really make this synth have a big impact by creating this moment of tension back. Okay, next we have the lead build, which is a synth I wanted to introduce to be kind of a counterweight to the lead synth, and it only comes twice here in the build parts before the diminished drop and the actual drop. And it kind of has the same aesthetic as these synths we've just looked at, but it's done actually with a preset from the Production Music Live library, and it uses collision, which is actually, I think, one of the most powerful synths that Ableton has to offer. So first of all, let's have a listen. So it's just kind of an energetic build-up sequence. Let's look at the MIDI quickly. Basically, it's pretty straightforward. It's all just also looping from here from 49 to 57. And then we've got kind of an harmonics change from 57 onward, just to create this peak and this moment where the energy converges kind of right before the drop. But the interesting part here is that, as I said, it's based on a collision preset from the Production Music Live library. But I tweaked it a little bit because I thought the original sound was very good, but I wanted a little bit more modulation. Since it's also an element leading up to our peak and to our drop, I just wanted to have something that, you know, really modulates a lot and creates an interesting soundscape. So what I did here was put in this LFO. I really like using randomness in my tracks a little bit, and this introduces a kind of random modulation that can lead, you know, to happy accidents. Some of the best things you come up with, maybe you've had it in your own experience, are often just the things that you didn't expect. So I always try to have a little degree of randomness in my tracks. And what this LFO is doing, can see it has a random waveform that generates a signal between 16% and 86%. And it's influencing which waveforms this wavetable synth generates. And I chose to have it oscillate between 16 and 86 or 84 because I think these waveforms in the middle are, you know, where you get these squelchy sounds, and I want to have like more of this and less of these, you know, on the top and the bottom. And let's see what it actually does to the synth. Let's listen to it with and without the LFO modulation. Actually go a little bit further back here. Yeah, it just adds this little bit of rock and roll, you know, a little bit of more tension to the build-up. And I think it really, you know, it makes this preset, which is already very, very good, it just gives it this little bit of edge, a little bit of extra modulation that makes it really interesting to me. And then obviously we process it with a bunch of reverb as usual, because, you know, there's a lot of reverb and echo in this track just because it's supposed to be big, roomy, monumental, strong. All right. So that concludes the lead part. Quickly want to look at the atmosphere. So here basically we also have just two synths, and they're both extremely washed out. They're supposed to fulfill the job of the pads pretty much here. So let's listen first of all to this stringy sound here. Very ethereal, very a sound that kind of builds over time. It also has a lot of effects and a pretty heavy sidechain, because we really don't want it to be present in the middle of the track. We really just want it to set the atmospheric scene for the actual elements that are supposed to be in the foreground to have just more melodic context. And maybe you already saw it a little bit, not all of these notes are actually being played. And there's also a little bit of randomness going in here. So let's listen to it again shortly. You can see what you're hearing is not completely adding up to what you're seeing here. And that's because of this beat repeat effect. That's just another way to introduce some randomness and some generative aspect to your synths. So basically what this is doing is a chance of 30% to trigger. And whatever it triggers, because this is set to insert, it will override the sound that's actually being played here. So that way we get a more rhythmic quality to it. And also every time the beat repeat is triggered right before a note, it will cancel out that note. But, you know, there's a chance it's set to 30%, so that will only happen 30% of the time. So every time we play this back, it will be slightly different. And I just love playing with that kind of thing, you know, where you can also just let it run for a long period of time and just see what it does, and then just pick out your favorite parts and just, you know, bounce them out and reintroduce them into the track. So that's just a great way to get results you may haven't been anticipating. And I think also the best way to use this, I think this is also based on a collision. Yeah, it's a collision. And I think collision is a great way to use this beat repeat, because these synths usually have a lot of percussive elements to them, and beat repeat works best if you have, you know, a very audible attack that can be properly, you know, affected by this beat repeat, where you can actually hear what it's doing. So we get this like twangy, rhythmically complex structure that just like adds some more texture in the background. And then finally we have this washed out element, which is just, again, a copy of this synth, basically, and like super heavily edited with a lot of reverb. You can see back here, a massive decay time, massive dry wet. Let's listen to it shortly. Yeah, it basically just sets the overall tone, you know. It doesn't really matter what you're playing here as long as it's harmonically in tune with the track. It's just another layer to make sure the monumentality carries throughout the track. And then down here we have a bunch of risers and impacts. also from, of course, Production Music Live samples. And then in this last section, we have the effects. And this is just kind of supporting elements to make sure that our drop really drops when it's supposed to, that the tension build-up is supported by elements, you know, that shake up the rhythmic structure of it a little bit in that part. Listen to the effects section. Or a better idea is probably to listen to the whole thing and just try to pay attention to what the effects section is doing. Yeah, this is a great way to get a lot out of simple samples. By placing like risers and impacts properly, you can just make sure that you support the synths that are really carrying your track, and that you just have this oof moment when the drop comes down on the listener. So it's like, in my opinion, it's kind of undervalued a little bit to really use impacts in the correct way. And then back here, we're kind of looping this build-up to have another groove element. So this was actually built from this snare roll right here and then looped and consolidated. And it's just a good idea to keep the homogeneous aesthetic of your track by reusing certain sounds. So if you have a build-up right here, you know, why not turn it into a percussive sample back here, just to make sure that, you know, it doesn't go too crazy with different sounds, different samples. I really like to focus on a few samples and then give them a lot of room to work in the track. All right, yeah, that concludes the rundown here for our buses here. One thing that I wanted to add, if you explore the preset a little bit, first of all, I do not use any send effects, which is kind of, I mean, there's a lot of reverb, a lot of echo in this track, so it would actually make sense to use send effects, and I encourage everyone to do that. The thing is though, that when I produce, I do analog stem mixing afterwards, and it's just a huge pain to bounce your track if you use send effects. So that's actually, I think using send effects is fine. Just if you're doing analog stem mixing, it just doesn't make any sense. So that's why I'm not using any here. And then the other thing that maybe is a little bit uncommon, if I open up these channels a little bit, you can see that I actually don't mix using the mixer. And that's just because I mean, that's a personal thing for everyone, but I just get a little bit confused, or I've noticed that I do a better job mixing if, instead of moving these faders here, sometimes I do automate some, but you know, I just try to keep them at 0. Instead, I'll just go into the tracks and mix with utilities. Just because I can always see these numeric values, I feel like I have more control over the process, but that's just a personal thing that I've started doing over the years. All right, that concludes the rundown. Thanks so much for watching. I really encourage everyone to download this template and, you know, just fiddle around with the signal chains here. Maybe make your own remixes or your own versions of the channels I've created here. And I think there's a lot to unpack here and a lot to work with. And if you have any questions about any of the techniques used here, please feel free to drop me a line in the comments or write me on Instagram at DAHU Music.